So welcome to this session on Trudeau's Canada, a liberal nirvana, ? So we are going to discuss today a country that's often used as a sort of good guy to America's bad guy. So when I came in the 1980s, I'm originally from Canada and came over to your fair country to help you with various different things like food and transport and the size of your houses and things like that. When I came over here, I noticed that there were so many Canadians, and the reason why there were so many Canadians, I saw everybody had a maple leaf on their backpack. And what it turned out, it was Americans who put a maple leaf on their backpack so that people wouldn't hate them so much. And this struck me as something symbolic about the country, is that nobody hates Canadians. Canadians are very benign. They're often presented as a sort of good side to America's bad side. So for instance, people will talk about the riots in the 1960s in the United States, but the peacefulness in Canada, about how ethnic groups tend to get along in Canada. I think we'll hear from the speakers that's not entirely straightforward, but it's always counterposed to the United States and all of the various different problems that are happening there. And I think Justin Trudeau really sums up in some ways. He personifies Canada and Canada's liberalness. And of course you will have seen Justin Trudeau in his spontaneous pictures of himself jogging topless past a group of women who are great fans of his. And he does tend to elicit different emotions, but many, many people really love him. Other people accuse him of being the Zoolander Prime Minister. You know, sort of all style, not a lot of substance behind him. So there's so many things that have happened in Canada recently that I think Trudeau personifies. So we've got a really excellent panel, and we're going to explore these kind of issues about the benign character of Canadians and Canada and Trudeau. First, we have Dr. Ashley Foley. Dr. Frawley is a senior lecturer in sociology and social policy and program director at Swansea University. Her two most recent books are Semiotics of Happiness, which was published in 2015, and she has a book coming out called Significant Emotions, which will be out in 2018. She is here because she is also, like me, a fellow Canadian, and just from next door, from our next province, just 800 miles away, nothing really in Canadian terms. Then we have, on my left, Professor Allan Holdsworth. He is president of the British Association of Canadian Studies, but he very much wants to make clear that he does not speak for the entire body of Canadian studies, and that his views are his own personal views. Finally, we have Rachael Revesz, and I've said that right? Yep. Excellent. And she is a freelance writer and journalist, and I also have connections with Rachael because where I live now in Durham, she attended university there. So we know many of the same pubs. So I'm going to start off firstly with Ashley, please.
So what I think Trudeau's rise symbolizes is that liberals evidently prefer style with no substance to no style and no substance. As he mentioned, as Canadians, we like to define ourselves by what we're not. And Trump, in that sense, is like a gift. For a long time, it was uncertain, this sense of smug superiority that Canadians, unfortunately, do sometimes have. It was kind of uncertain with Barack Obama and Stephen Harper, this sort of conservative prime minister. But in many ways, it's kind of obvious to point out. A lot of people said, yeah, he's really slick. But what are the dangers of good PR? What are the dangers of very nice-sounding rhetoric? Well, I want to focus on an area that I know best myself, not speaking for all First Nations people in Canada, but as an Ojibwe woman, there are a lot of things that I hear from Trudeau that strike me as familiar and that worry me. So when he talks about Indigenous, so it's very, I feel like British people don't really know what I said. Indigenous, First Nations, these are similar words. You might recognize Native American. Anyways, when he's talking about Indigenous sort of people, he sort of shed tears, and very recently, when the lead singer of the Tragically Hip died, he cried in public very famously. And as I was sort of preparing for this talk, I spoke with a lot of my family members. You know, what did they think about it, and particularly as my family is quite active in First Nations issues in Canada. And it was very interesting because there was a lot of, oh, you know, it's so great that he's sending this message about femininity and masculinity, and, you know, all around the world, masculinity is having a huge, disproportionate impact on politics, and it's time to let the feminine back in. So it's very important that he shows this kind of emotion. And when then, you know, on the other side, down the line, well, he's a good-looking guy, but I'm not really sure what he's done, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of very sort of symbolic politics, and you know, that it all looks very nice. But when I was talking particularly to my family members that are interested in First Nations issues, one thing that I noticed was this tendency to kind of dance around. There's this optimism about Trudeau and what he will do for Indigenous people. But as for instance, my aunt was talking, and she was saying, you know, it's so good, these feminine ideals. I was thinking, what about the problems with social workers taking children? What about the land grabs? What about self-determination? These are things I know we care about. And I don't know if there's going to be any progress. The response I got, well, you know, there's a lot of red tape. I've been hearing that for a long time. I don't think it's just red tape. Trudeau's been criticized for style over substance and for failing to follow through with promises. But what is actually more likely is that his slick style represents a sort of disarming cover for the policies of previous governments. And one of these is a focus on reconciliation. So reconciliation has a lot of facets, and one of those is material. That is a responsibility or a recognition that there's a need to do something about the serious material problems that exist both on and off reservations for First Nations people in Canada. However, the other side of reconciliation, which is perhaps more palatable, is about healing, apologizing, making amends for the past. And it's important to note that one of the key goals of First Nations communities is self-determination. Indigenous claims to self-determination are a direct challenge to the Western nation-states' notions of the liberal subject, and that they don't see the nation-state as their representative. Indigenous peoples pre-exist nation-states and reject nation-state authority to grant them a right to a political self-determination that they never relinquished. And so there's a lot of debate about what this means in practice. However, we don't really hear a lot about those debates. Rather, the only time that people seem to want to hear from First Nations people is when they're telling atrocity tales. And so Indigenous people are frequently invited to speak their truth to power. And this is great because it provides a great photo op. You know, you see Trudeau crying real tears and that sort of thing when First Nations people are talking. But what's happened with this endless stream of atrocity tales about sexual abuse, the emotional and psychological impact of colonization, has been that First Nations people have been bound, their problems have been bound up with this cycles of trauma theories, which basically says that most of the problems facing them are down to, you know, First Nations people, but women in particular, have been deprived of their mothers, and therefore they lack the parenting skills with which to raise their children, and therefore really it's not their fault that we take their children away, just the way that it is. And so countries like Canada and Australia have experienced a major shift toward individual and psychological understandings of society. And as this shift took place, poverty, drug addiction, alcoholism, and social dissolution became medicalized and portrayed as colonial trauma. But these issues have material roots. As Diane Million writes, while the crisis is the ongoing effects of poverty and continuing dissolution in communities and extreme marginalization from mainstream freedoms, complete lack of infrastructure, I would add, they're posed with the need to heal. In this context, self-determination is redefined to mean self-management and empowerment to manage ourselves in government-prescribed ways. And if you think I'm sort of overreacting, you know, we're sort of invited into this public sphere where really we want to talk about self-determination, but instead we're invited to talk about how we can't care for ourselves, let alone our children, because we're so traumatized and so on. But somehow, we're also making the demand in the exact same place that we want control over our communities. Right? There's a contradiction between those two things. And I'm not overreacting. This is a problem that's existed in a lot of Indigenous communities around the world, and Australia is a cautionary tale. They followed the same path to sort of reconciliation, talking about symbolic blames for the outcomes of colonial policies, cycles of abuse, and so on. In 2007, an appeal for aid to stem child sexual abuse in some communities led to the declaration of a national emergency. and Australia became the first colonial nation-state to rescind Aboriginal self-determination on child protection grounds. And this effectively rescinded any self-governance achieved in these territories in earlier negotiations. And I think that this is a cautionary tale not only for Native communities in Canada, but for the rest of us. You might have noticed, maybe you recognize cycles of trauma. You hear this all the time when we talk about poorer communities. Really, it's not their fault that they're poor. They're growing up without good parents, and they just lack the parenting skills, and that's why 50% of them are referred to social services and so on. So this emphasis on symbolic politics of reconciliation over material problems facing Native people has the danger that it constructs people as victims. This emphasis on emotion and emotional damage basically says everyone is in need of paternalistic care. It constructs people as unable to govern themselves, and that's what's happening elsewhere in the world. And it will happen here as well if we're not careful to demand that we be treated as rational subjects with real material problems, rather than nice-sounding words, images, and emotiveness. We should demand to be treated as rational subjects capable of self-governing.
Professor Hallsworth.
Oh, thank you, Kevin. Justice for Justin, just in 5 minutes. That's going to be tricky, isn't it? Liberal nirvana, yes, no, and maybe, I think was where I got to by the time I finished trying to drop some notes down on this piece of paper here. On the plus side, we've heard the personal charm of the guy, and we've also seen some very practical things. We've seen gender-balanced ministers, which is an interesting concept, but their mandates are published. There's openness. The civil servants are ungagged. The government scientists are allowed to speak. And I've also heard, since Trudeau came to power, 3 of his ministers speak, all extremely well briefed, all extremely confident, all putting forward a very good vision of Canada. And also we have, I'll ignore the First Nations issues which we've just covered, but something like 30,000 Syrian immigrants are being given just over $1,000 a month, so there's support there. And I have friends in Canada who have children with life-size Justin cardboard cutouts in the bedroom, and you can't imagine that with John Diefenbaker, can you? So on the plus side, yes. 2 other things to think about, though. Let's look back and let's look south. Looking back, Justin isn't coming into an environment that's really very easy to change very quickly. If you look at the debates, for example, over President Obama and his right to appoint to the Supreme Court, which was blocked, Stephen Harper, Justin's predecessor, made a number of appointments to the Supreme Court. He made a number of appointments to Senate. So there is a residual conservative mindset that will take quite a lot of time to change. The other thing, of course, is that when you look at Canadian prime ministers, like other political figures, and I got this idea from a copy of our journal and some free examples for people who would like to run away with them. A colleague, Wayne Hunt, described, I think it was Isaiah Berlin's original concept of hedgehogs and foxes. And you could characterize Stephen Harper as a hedgehog, intransigent, unwilling to change, quite keen to make sure his viewpoints would stick around for quite a long time. Whereas Justin, it seems to me, is very much a fox. Justin will go with the flow, he'll look at what's changed, and he'll change accordingly. And I think that raises some issues with what's happened south of the border. It would be an interesting world if Stephen Harper had been there alongside Trump. In fact, he was mostly alongside Obama. And if you match up the presidents and the prime ministers, it's interesting how the one quite often constrains the other, usually in one direction. So when I listen to Minister McKenna, who's the Environment Minister, she's also the Environment Minister and Climate Change Minister. And her first role was to go to Paris for the Climate Change Accords and make some very, very positive comments about where Canada was on climate change. Then we have President Trump, who is not quite so keen on the concept of climate change and its reality. And of course, then it all starts to happen in quite different ways. We have Boeing bringing in a trade dispute with Bombardier and getting the backing of President Trump. So poor defense of little Boeing is taking on that massive snowmobile manufacturer. But other things that are very difficult for Justin to change are the nature of the Canadian economy. If you look at what Canada does most, if you wanted to characterize it in one word, it would probably be mining. most big mining companies have an office in Canada. And Canada doesn't always say, maybe you shouldn't do that when they misbehave in other countries. They tend to say that's the other country's problem. And for me, this raises some interesting issues to do with the trade deals that we're going to be looking at, and which I assume everybody's been shown every single paragraph of all the way through. Maybe not. I'm getting not a lot of yeses out there. One of the things that would tend to happen, even if we go back to previous Liberal governments, would the likelihood that there would be some investor-state dispute system clauses in there. And these can be very unhappy if you happen to be on the wrong side of them. And they could very well be cemented into trade laws. And you would not expect any Canadian government, even a Trudeau government, to say, well, those are the kinds of things we don't want to see in those deals. Most Canadian governments would be quite content to see things like that in those deals, particularly when you're heavily into extractive industries, which, of course, is part of the interface with the First Nations that I said I wasn't going to talk about. Other issues, I think probably the one thing that came up lately, and I should say that I'm also ignoring provincial issues, and one of the things that perhaps is worth remembering is the oil in Canada tends to be Alberta's oil, and the NDP are in power in Alberta. And the interesting point there is that they are not in power to say we want to keep this oil in the ground. What they're saying is we want to work out why our sovereign wealth fund is only 17 billion. And Norway, with a population of 1 million more, has a sovereign wealth fund of 960 billion. And by the way, that's the British sovereign wealth fund, just in case you were wondering. So there are issues that Justin can't control. There are provincial jurisdictions. Universities are a provincial jurisdiction. So his hands are tied in many kinds of directions. But the one thing that worries me, just to conclude on this one, is the link that he's supposedly had, and it's being floated at the moment, to the possibility of linking to the US missile defense system. And I was listening earlier to the debate, a very good debate on Putin's Russia. And for the first time in a little while, we were talking about the Cold War and where we're going next with nuclear weapons. And one of the things that you need to worry about if you're talking about a missile defense system is it works best if you've already done a preemptive first strike on your enemy and you use your missile defense system to pick off what they've got left. And that, to me, is the sort of thing that I would prefer not to be happening. And maybe Justin needs to think a bit more about whether he wants to sign up to that kind of thing. Maybe he doesn't. Let's find out.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, we have Rachael.
Thanks, Kevin. So the question is whether Canada is this liberal nirvana, and I guess I would say I wish. The only utopia I can think of reading about recently is in southwest China. I think it's called the Mazuo, and it's where women rule. So I'm looking forward to that day. Trudeau has, yes, he has surfed on this wave of positive coverage from abroad, and he is known for the good looks and the yoga moves and the smiling and the crying and declaring he is a feminist, which to me is actually extremely important. I hope we can come back to that topic. But yeah, when you talk to Canadians, as I have done in preparation for this, another picture emerges, and there are many frustrations with him. Of course, the rights of First Nation and Indigenous people, there's a serious danger that after 2 years, this could be the mark on his legacy, that he's refused to uphold their right to veto certain projects. He's now built these two pipelines, so that's not a good start. But yeah, there's a contrasting picture as well when he says he's a feminist, because when you read his website, the way he talks about his wife, I find really disturbing. It's almost kind of sickening, talking about the way that, you know, she made him feel giddy and she resisted his advances, but she knew she was the one, and I just find this whole pedestal thing really quite off-putting. But what is keeping him in power is, at the moment, the economy. Canada is the fastest growing country in the G7. Unemployment is at 9-year low. And it's quite refreshing to see this kind of thing from a Liberal leader when we hear from the Conservatives in the UK that you know, a good economy would not be possible. So, yeah, but unfortunately, if you rely on commodities, mining and oil, you know your future is volatile at best, as we've seen that in 2015-16 as well. His good looks have perhaps helped to get him into power, and it's ironic that they can help a man get into power and help get a woman out of it. And on a very basic level, I'm sure we all know this, he's of course the antithesis to Trump in many ways, so I won't spend too long on it. I think it's quite clear, but in terms of immigration, trade, his views on women's rights, LGBT views, when Trump stayed silent on those 6 Muslims that were killed in Quebec, when that white man burst into a mosque, Trump remained silent for a long time. Normally he takes to Twitter straight away, whereas Trudeau strongly condemned the killings and even got his office to phone Fox News to retract a misleading tweet about the shooter's ethnicity. And while Trump is, looking to protectionism and isolationism, Trudeau clearly is not looking to China now, which might anger Trump. That might be interesting. And he was clearly angered by those 300% tariffs slapped on Bombardier, which also affects Northern Ireland. Very importantly, Canada does not demonize immigrants or make them into scapegoats, and that's an issue that actually has quite a broad consensus. I mean, here it seems impossible that Conservatives and UKIP or whoever is on the right speaks about immigrants in the same way that Conservatives in Canada do. I know there's been recent problems, but we can debate that. It's really important that Canada maintains that open image, whereas Australia and even the UK remains this very closed image. It's all about how can we control, how can we stop. Canada recognises the importance of immigrants to its economy, which it needs to keep its population and its economy going. But I know Kevin will agree with me on this, that many things we praise Canada for predate Trudeau and his government. And the liberal beacon we see now has emerged from a very dark, racist past, just like the US, just like many countries. When I first came to London, I lived with a lady called Ruth, a Jewish lady, and she and her family had sailed across the world, and they were turned away in 1939 from Canada. So clearly, the contrast has happened over many years. But there are challenges ahead, of course. There's NAFTA, which is in the headlines constantly. Bombardier has given us a clue as to that difficult future. His failure to transform the voting rights system, the rights of Indigenous people. Even my friend was grumbling about, public transport, for example, where she lives in Toronto, a possible house price bubble. Many issues that other countries face. I feel like Trudeau does get some unfair slack when it comes to the PR. As a journalist, I know the danger of PR and following the press rather than the actual story. But I can't think of a recent male leader that we haven't seen him with his top off, whether he wants to or not. So I feel like we should not focus on that so much, even though I know Canadians are frustrated with the photo ops. But maybe he should focus on the here and now and prove to people in his own country, while he's still got time, that he really has created this liberal nirvana that people abroad believe he has done.
Right, thank you very much. Yes, I was just trying to think of male leaders that we've seen with their tops off, and I can't think of... Putin has his top off, yes, but I'm trying to... And David Cameron we've seen, it's not good, really, is it? Although Justin Trudeau not quite as bad as the others, perhaps. So, yes, we've got quite a few interesting issues on the table. It strikes me that Canada is a sort of early adopter. It's almost a model liberal nation in some ways. One thing that brought it home to me was that I was looking at my hometown news, as you do once in a while, and this was about 7 or 8 years ago, and there was an issue about a 9-year-old transsexual child demanding a gender-neutral bathroom. And that was the first place I had seen that discussion. It took off in the United States in a big way after that. But it strikes me that Canada is an early adopter in that. And it also is very similar to various different European nations. There's a sort of a big competition between Belgium and the Netherlands, and to a certain extent Denmark, about who can be the most liberal nation. And I think Canada is also in that nexus of becoming this great liberal nation that can bring things in. And that, of course, can have, it's a double-edged sword. So, for instance, Canada legalized euthanasia and assisted suicide. And, of course, it was a very early adopter as a nation of that, whereas in other nations, it's sort of not been quite so quick. And it depends on your perspective on assisted suicide and euthanasia, whether you think that's a good thing. But it's also, I think I'd also like to hear what people think of Trudeau, because I see it from the outside. I've left Canada since then, and I'm not sure how everybody else sees Canada and Trudeau. As I think Rachael said, that there's a difference between the way people see Trudeau from inside. So I'd welcome any of your thoughts.
I'd just like to ask a question. Is the form of pseudo-liberalism shown by Trudeau really unique to him? Or, because as many politicians throughout time, and most recently Hillary Clinton through her election campaign, did show a bit of sort of liberal policies. And does he get a lot of leeway given to him because he is a left-wing populist in a time of rising right-wing populism? Thank you.
I think Canada's much less of a liberal nirvana. It's more of a lefty, illiberal hellhole. If you look recently, the Canadian Parliament passed a bill saying, essentially, shutting down free speech, criticising Islam, which is a problem, I think, because since when did liberalism mean shutting down criticisms of other opposing ideas? So I think Canada's showing a really worrying precedent of sort of growing liberal, illiberal sort of progressive, so-called progressive ideas, which is actually a really sort of morphed, twisted version of what is essentially classical liberalism.
In April of last year, Trudeau made a widely publicised assertion at a University of Ottawa forum about how we can do so much better on voting reform, and he made it, I believe, one of a cornerstone of his pledges in the election that he would reform voting and the voting system. And it's also been much publicised about his failure. And it seems to me that, given that almost every single other major party, including the Conservatives, want voting reform, and Trudeau seems to say that a referendum on such would be divisive. What are your thoughts on that?
To me, I think it's incredibly sexist to focus on whether he's, that he's a male, or to even talk about whether leaders are male or female. The question is Trudeau the best that Canada has to offer, and is he doing things that are in alignment with Canadian values?
My family just spent 3 months in Canada, and there's a lot to love. It's sporty, they're very interested in British people, and there's a lot of gorgeous beer there. We particularly like the skiing, I think. But there's something which is insidious, really, that turns up all the time in the newspapers, and it was just alluded to by the person in the audience at the front, and that is anything to do with free speech. And it's in a very wide variety of contexts. So there was the M103 private members bill that was just mentioned. There was the scandal of Trudeau endorsing the Canadians' TV history. It produced as part of the Canada 150 anniversary. There was Mike Ward fined by the Ontario Human Rights Commission for telling jokes about disabled people. There was Andrew Potter, who was expelled from Montreal's McGill University for criticising the nature of Francophone society in Quebec. There's Jordan Peterson, that people may well have heard of, who's lost his research grant as a result of using genderless pronouns, or not, rather refusing to use genderless pronouns. And then, most ironically of all, while we were there was a guy called Niaz, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce the name, but he was forced to resign as editor of an author's magazine called Write for asking basically white authors to use cultural experiences from Amerindian societies in their novels. And he was forced out of a writer's magazine editorship for that. I mean, it seems to me a very illiberal country in the respect of freedom of speech.
Okay, thanks very much. Panel, would you like to come back on any of those? Is Trudeau's liberalism unique, or is it something that is very much of its time? Is Canada a liberal nirvana, or is it a lefty hellhole? And about the voting reform, there was a question there. And also, I would defend my panel against the question about sexism. It's me formulating the whole thing, so the fault would be with me. But are we being sexist by talking about Trudeau in these kind of terms as man and top off and everything else like that?
I'm happy to pick up a couple points.
And finally, the free speech one. Yes?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
So on the very first question, I think it was the first question, is he getting leeway because he's left-wing? No, I think it could well be the opposite in some way. The bar is set so incredibly high against him. It's like when Obama was offered the Nobel Prize, and and then people said he didn't deserve it. Well, he was offered it. He won it. I mean, the bar is set high, and I don't think it's always fair. So, and in this world of rising extremism and far right politics, I think he has to work with these leaders as well. It's not going to be easy. And when issues like immigration have become so polarized, he's got a tough task ahead of him. The free speech is really tricky because I really object to phrases like this PC mad culture. Clearly you can get the sense that I wouldn't agree with that, to be honest. I think lines have to be set. When Trump was elected, when Brexit happened, the number of whether you want to link it directly or not, the number of hate crimes rose. There becomes new normals, and people think progress is inevitable. It's not. We slip backwards. Laws can be undone. It's much easier to derail what the guy before you did than to set up new, positive, constructive change. So we have to stamp down when we think that something is inappropriate. So yeah, I do think it's liberal. I do think it's knowing when people have crossed the line, and that's good for society because it shows a very strong message that you can't get away with certain stuff just because you think you have the right to say it, because it has a knock-on effect in society, especially if you have a platform and you're using that platform. And lastly, I'd also like to pick up on the lady who said it was sexist to point out he's a man. I think I agree in the sense it's kind of wrong to focus on the top off, and I made that in jest, but on that same vein, he appointed this 50% female cabinet, and I know there are critics of that, but I think that's extremely important because girls growing up today, they need to see someone doing something to think they can do it too, and if they don't have role models, it's really hard to see yourself as a foreign minister or to see yourself as the leader. In Canada, we haven't had a female prime minister. We've only had one female prime minister, and she lasted a few months, arguably because she had to inherit a mess from the guy before her. And she said, there was stationery made for me. I didn't even have time to use it, and I hope that another woman leader will have time to use that stationery that was made for me. So I think it's very important, and I think it's not just a case of appointing who can do the best job, because we're set up in a society that doesn't reward those talents at the moment.
Alan, do you want to?
Yeah, just quickly to go back in the history, I'm better equipped than anybody else on the panel to go that far back. I'm just thinking about Trudeau and that sort of charisma thing. Of course, his father was probably the only Canadian Prime Minister that you would characterize as being charismatic. If you go back to Mackenzie King, who was in power for about 20 years, who was described by Truman's people as not someone with any great personal charm or speaking ability or whatever, but he saw himself as the statesman. He was there to tell the citizenry what to do, and did it very successfully for a long period of time, and had the advantage of sitting opposite Roosevelt, who was, of course, American president for 12 years. You can't do it anymore, thank goodness. But then if you go to Pierre, and we haven't said just watch me, but certainly Pierre had some interesting times, and I was living in Canada when he did. His misfortune, I think, was to have ideas about where Canada should go, and have some very strong ideas about where Canada should go at a time when the global economy was being changed by Thatcher and Reagan in a completely different direction, but it's still in. And he was looking in a different direction, and it pretty much finished his career. So if I were called Trudeau, I think I'd be looking at what my father had been up to and what the kind of difficulties were that he faced, and be quite careful, and maybe that's what he's doing.
Okay, and Ashley.
Yeah, so I think that a number of really important points were brought up. I think it's really Orwellian, and I find in Canada, I find it more and more difficult to go back and talk to anyone. So I just bang my head against a wall constantly. So it's basically illiberalism is liberalism. Sexism is anti-sexism. That's what it sounds like to me. People are sort of, I think you need to have a healthy distrust of the government. And I think it's very dangerous when you can be so easily disarmed by very nice sounding things. Nobody likes to have their feelings hurt. Nobody likes it when people say things that we don't agree with. But do you trust the government enough to take away rights to free speech? That is a dangerous, dangerous thing to do. And I feel like there's not nearly enough opposition in Canada to that. And I think about the sexism comment was really good, because I found, you know, that discourse of like, oh, you know, Trudeau's crying and that questions masculinity and femininity. Why the hell should me as a woman be more emotional and feminine? I find that incredibly insulting. Yeah, it's basically saying because you have a vagina, it determines who you're going to be and how you will be as a leader, or because you have a penis or whatever. And that's a very old kind of sexist idea that, you know, you are determined by your sex. And it's sort of like, oh, we need more women in government, and somehow that's going to end war. That's a very, very, you know, poor understanding of what actually causes war. And I think this goes back to this sort of individualization of social problems, that ultimately it comes down to our feelings and how we act in the world, and if only we could just be more expressive and so on, suddenly all these problems would disappear. I think that's actually very, very, very poor understanding of social problems, and ultimately an effective way of dealing with them.
Okay, thanks very much. We're going to go out to the audience again.
As a gay man from the center of the tar sands in Alberta, I would like to start by saying I don't think Justin Trudeau is that attractive at all. He has oily, gross hair, and I think his body looks weird, and I just think he looks just freaky. So anyway, starting with that.
Thank you for that balance.
Diversity of opinions. I'll start by saying one thing I think Trudeau has done well, and I think he's recognized that he is a person who has no real experience in governing a country whatsoever. The man has experience being a snowboard instructor. He taught, I think, science or something in a high school in Toronto for 2 years, gave a eulogy at his father's funeral, and all of a sudden is now an MP. So the guy recognizes where he comes from, and to compensate for that, has surrounded himself with a cabinet that actually know quite a bit about what they're doing. You know, I think both of our ministers for immigration have been, you know, refugees or peoples who have immigrated to Canada. Our Minister of Health was a doctor, and our Minister of Defense was a former, is a veteran. So he surrounded himself with people that know what they're doing, and he sort of reserved this position for himself as sort of a diplomat general. Trudeau is quite good at going to international summits at the UN, the World Economic Forum, and he is good at sort of branding Canada. And he leaves a lot of the difficult things, I think the actual politicking, to his cabinet. So you can judge him by that criteria if you want, but I think it's working to a degree. Having said that, he's dropped the ball on quite a few things. Electoral reform has already been brought up, but I'm really happy that it was this issue of somebody being put in the line of fire to mop up somebody's mess has been brought up, because when electoral reform fell apart, it was a very young female MP from Burlington, Ontario that was given the post of electoral reform, and she essentially received all of the blowback from that really horrendous debacle. And so I think that legacy of putting people in the line of fire is not gone. I think marijuana legalization has been done in an incredibly sloppy way. We have no idea what's going to happen, and I don't see any reason why anybody who purchases marijuana on the street in a very safe way, as I've done so myself, is ever going to engage in this formalized market that's just going to drive prices up and question lots of things. I think it's done in a really terrible way. We're still selling arms to Saudi Arabia. I want everybody to know that. Canada sells weaponized vehicles to Saudi Arabia that are used in Yemen. This is deplorable, and there isn't enough discussion about it. And I could talk about the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry, which has also been another debacle with lots of money being thrown at a problem, which I think is a legacy of the way the federal government has tried to engage with Indigenous communities overall. And one last thing, I'm sorry I'm talking a lot. One last thing, we haven't talked yet about the rise of Jagmeet Singh as the new leader of the NDP, who has essentially seen what Trudeau has done and has carbon copied it to himself. He's a guy who has been on the cover, not on the cover, he's been in like GQ-esque magazines for his attractive physique and his fashion sense. And he's now going to be the new leader of the NDP. Going into the next election, I see the people who would have voted for Trudeau in the last election move to Jagmeet. We're going to split the left, and the Conservatives are going to be back in power, pumping oil out of Alberta and leaving Canada to be what was described a sort of lefty hellhole for time to come. So that's my rant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think the free speech issue is Trudeau's greatest failure. The biggest mistake, I think, so far has been Bill C-16, which is this Jordan Peterson debacle. It ushers in a new form of free speech infringement, where instead of just preventing people from saying things, you're now compelling people to say things, and I think it's a very, very, very dangerous move and could lead to the true descent into sort of authoritarianism in Canada.
When I was going to talk initially, I was going to criticize Trudeau, but I feel like he's gotten quite a lot of bad rap in the room. And I think what people need to remember is that unlike the UK, in which you guys have hung parliaments, Canada has minority governments. And so we've had numerous minority governments under Stephen Harper that has quite disappointed the population, the Canadian population, and has been very frustrating for particularly young Canadians. Now, that said, I think a lot of what we're talking about in terms of liberalism and being led by the government is actually led by the people and not being able to sort of express themselves. And now that we have this sort of, placeholder, that it now becomes easier for Canadians themselves to demand these changes. So I really want to sort of caution, because it was sort of addressed on the panel, a lot of it is out of Trudeau's hands, right? So what happens in universities, what happens in provinces is actually not Trudeau's decision at all, and is driven by the Canadian people. And I think actually Trudeau is very clever in that he responds to that, right? So he's more of a mirror. He's not initiating change. In fact, he's sort of mirroring the change that he sees within Canada. So that's something to keep in mind sort of when we criticize this liberal, this country. That in mind, Trudeau did lead a campaign relying on young people. And what I've seen lately among my friends, particularly back in Canada, is there's this overall and overwhelming disappointment with Trudeau all of a sudden. So, for example, in the Toronto Pride Parade, someone posted on Instagram, "Hey, look, it's the guy we hate." And it was a picture of Trudeau. And I want to ask, why is it that youth were so on board with him and now they don't like him anymore? And it's actually, in fact, the older generation that's quite in favor of him.
Interesting, thank you. Yes, one of the things that strikes me about Canada and Trudeau is that there's a sort of sense of eating themselves. Like the problem is with this liberalism that it becomes open to any kind of criticism, and so it responds to criticism. That's the way I think the Liberal government seems to operate at some stage. So you have now also a Québécois headscarf ban on Muslim women, and it's being discussed in the news. It's not absolutely set, but there's a big discussion about whether the Quebec should ban headscarves and whether the federal government should step in if they do. And you get this sense that there's a very malleable government, that it responds to things very immediately and simply responds to them rather than having any sort of agenda. It responds to various different agendas. That gentleman there made some interesting points. There's also a sort of backdoor legalization of heroin that it seems to be occurring, for instance, in British Columbia, where the courts have stopped the police from arresting people with heroin, which is still illegal in Canada, on the basis that they were in a safe space of where they were able to inject freely, and that it was actually an attack on their rights according to the Canadian Constitution, which we should also probably talk about. And so I think it's a very interesting problem that Canada has, that it responds to things so well. Even the way that euthanasia was legalized began with a court case in 2012. One judge struck down the law against assisted suicide, and then the Supreme Court backed it and ordered Parliament to actually change the law. And that seems to be the backward way of doing things. It should be Parliament making laws, and then the courts interpret those laws. Anyway, sorry to intervene as chair, but I just think it's very interesting questions. Anybody else have some points in there before I bring speakers there? Yes?
I've got some information as to why the youth is potentially now disillusioned with Trudeau, and as to why the older generation are starting to pull towards him. I would say it's because essentially Trudeau is an Instagram president. He's very inauthentic. He's a master of depicting himself as being one way, but behind closed doors, when he's meeting with powerful people, acting in other ways. He sheds tears for the native people, and yet controversies go on all the time about the way the Canadian authorities are shown to truly respond to their needs. He's there at the airport meeting Syrian families, shaking their hands, and yet Canada's selling arms to Saudi Arabia and is dealing with all sorts of weapons companies and causing harm in the Middle Eastern region. He says, he says I'm a feminist and still deals with Saudi Arabia. It goes on more and more and more. The younger generation, they spend a lot more time on the internet, quite frankly. And being on the internet, you are able to find some more enlightenment as to both sides of the dichotomy. You're able to realize that he is depicting himself differently to how he's actually acting. Whereas on the news, they will spend the entirety of the cycle just discussing the gesture rather than the true actions and evaluating him as such. I think this is a huge problem across politics at the moment. It was said earlier that Obama deserved his Nobel Peace Prize. He truly is. He was an inspirational character. He was brilliant. There was a black president, but during his first term in office, he killed more people with drone strikes than people who died during the Spanish Civil War. And quite frankly, I don't think that's deserving of a Nobel Peace Prize by any means. It's really quite two-faced, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Panel, would you like to come in on anything?
Perhaps I could come back in on something that you mentioned there, which was the issue of Quebec and headscarves. It seems to me that the debate that took place in Quebec was quite a balanced one. The Bouchard-Taylor report was about reasonable accommodation, and it did consult very widely. And I'm a little bit nervous about talking about Quebec because we've got Jocelyn de Tourneau from Laval University sitting there, and he may have a quite different view on how that was handled. But I thought that it was a responsible response by the provincial government to what was obviously a very high-profile debate that was going on. And they did seem to me to tackle it pretty well.
Yeah, I'm just picking up on the point about Jagmeet Singh. I'm glad you brought him up. Obviously, as a new leader, it'd be interesting to see if Trudeau ends up, I don't like the word pandering, that sounds really negative, but as you say, that carbon copy of his policies as Singh looks to kind of tackle, racist tactics within the police, like profiling and the decriminalisation of possession of drugs. It'll be really interesting to see if Trudeau copies that going forward. And it was interesting, actually, that Singh was talking about how he has this fantastic sense of style, but he does it very deliberately because he knows how he might be perceived, and he wants people to see that he's less, in his own words, problematic. And I think that does say a lot about whatever's going on at the surface. There's clearly underlying tensions. You might go to Toronto or Vancouver and there are more melting pots, but Canada hasn't totally erased, obviously, racism, and that's something the immigration minister, who gave a great TEDx talk recently about, it's all about diversity, and that's why I believe so strongly in appointing diversity is important, and appointing women, appointing people of colour to the cabinet, because they will be the ones that make the decisions and inspire people to follow in their footsteps. So I'm all for that.
Okay, and Ashley, I'm sorry to again jump in, but one of the interesting questions that I've got is, what should Canada do about First Nations people? Because it's yes, a bit of $1 million question.
It's like asking what to do about Palestine. Like you can't.
Yes, it is. But I'd love to have your views.
Oh God. Okay. No, I can't. It's okay. I believe in self-determination, and I think that it's probably not possible to cede land, but that would be ideal. Perhaps I'm not 100% sure. I haven't thought this through to its logical conclusion, but I think at the very least, First Nations people should ultimately have a say in how they deal with social issues. So, just because we keep being invited onto international stages to talk about sex abuse and stuff like that doesn't mean that that's the kind of issues that people would bring to the fore if they could, that's not how people would conceptualize the problems that face us. Actually, traditionally, there's a lot of optimism about the future, which famously bites us, like if you look at like Nostradamus prophecies, it's all doom and gloom. Our prophecies were all like wonderful. Doesn't really tell you much about how good our prophecies were. But there's a lot of optimism, and so there's a tendency toward optimism, but you don't get that idea when you talk to people, when you hear stories publicly. It's all about horror, like horror stories, that sort of thing. But actually, I think people would tell a much more positive story about what they want and their capabilities within their communities. I think ultimately Native people should have a say about resources. We need to do something about economic infrastructure on reserves. That's the problem. Like, there's no infrastructure. If you want to make something of yourself, you've got to move off reserve. And so the people who are left behind are in dire straits, and you can't hold a mortgage. Like, it's a problem. And there's so much in the way of dealing with those problems, because dealing with the Native problem is like $1 million industry. So there's just so many interests, and constantly Native people are being told, oh, well, you know, it's not your fault you can't raise your children. I went to this conference a few years ago where I was really disgusted, but I couldn't figure out why. It was like an FNIGC conference. It was like a First Nations Information Governance. It was all about Native people do not want to be studied anymore. Like, we don't want to be studied like lab rats. We don't want people coming in constantly telling us how to raise our kids, how to do this, how to do that. And they were like, I went to a presentation where this guy had a puppet, and he was like, we use this puppet in these games to tell First Nations children how they should go home and make sure that their parents like read stories with them, and you know, they're trying everything they can to make it sound really nice for all these government initiatives to come into people's lives and tell them how to raise their kids, because they're certain that the problems are really down to bad parenting. And you hear that, I hear that in the UK constantly about poorer people, and it echoes. I think, oh no, you don't go down that path. Don't go down that path, because, and it's like, no, we're not saying it's a bad thing. We're all ruled by emotions. Aren't we all a little mentally ill? That sort of course, you know, we made the wrong decision about Brexit. We were ruled by our emotions. It's okay. No, you have to fight against it. Sounds really nice. All these very, very sexist, racist ideas have been recast in this lovely, fuzzy language where we're all supposed to admit that. Well, actually, it's very disarming, and it becomes a way of taking away people's ability to, their claim to rationally govern themselves, to choose how to lead their lives, to be sort of strong citizens. It really undermines that and constructs everybody as a bunch of victims who need a paternalistic state.
Thank you. That's
Quick follow up on that one. We haven't really talked too much about idle no more. And yes, in a sense, there is a real possibility, if things don't improve, that we will see a resurgence of that movement, yes, which was clearly very high profile.
Jocelyn, did you want to say anything about the Qubcois issue? Because I'd be kind of interested in what you had to say about that.
Depends what you mean by the Qubcois issue. If you mean...
sorry, the headscarf issue is the one I'm thinking of.
Basically, the government decided that people would be, in a way, obliged to give public service without... with the face open. I'm sorry, English is not my language, right? and they will have to receive those services the same way. But I don't want to pinpoint the Qubcois against the rest of Canada in that case, because I've read in the newspapers that a survey has been conducted about the way Canadians would react in terms of the Quebec decision. And it was a majority of Canadians who would accept that way of dealing with the situation. So in that case, in particular, I don't think that we can make a divide between Quebec on the one side and the rest of Canada on the other side. There's a kind of common denominator to find a way out that is quite centered, I would say. Perhaps just one remark about the debate. If people were expecting to consider Canada as a kind of country going left, they were probably mistaken, because that country has never been that way, and I'm not seeing the country going that way. It's Trudeau, in a way, is in the mainstream of the Canadian historical experience, which is very, very much centered-oriented.
Okay, I didn't prepare for this part, but I guess listening to today, summing up, somebody asked about the youth and the power of the youth. I mean, politics is volatile. Yes, the youth can swing it either way, but ultimately, he's only been in 2 years. I mean, what does anyone ever get done in 2 years? Obama had 8, and it took Trump, what, like a year to dismantle most of it. So I hope, as I said earlier, that Trudeau would be, whatever this debate around, free speech, etc., I hope that in the future Trudeau will be more tempted to go the way of Jagmeet Singh than the Conservatives who want to lower taxes on everybody. And I don't believe in trickle-down economics for lower taxes for the rich. So that's my hope for the Trudeau future.
Okay, thank you. Allan?
Well, it's certainly the case, as we can see from the number of people in the room, that Trudeau has raised the profile of Canada and what goes on in Canada. And also, of course, during the debate, we've uncovered some of the difficulties that you have if you try to run a system that is sort of Westminster parliamentary, but it isn't because of the British North America Act giving so much power to the provinces and control of resources to the provinces. So it's a different country to try to run. And of course, I think for the first year it was going pretty well for Justin, but the Trump effect south of the border, I think, is something that is preoccupying him, and it may lead him off in directions that people probably wouldn't want to see him going in.
Okay, thank you very much. And Ashley, any final comments?
I just wanted to mention really quickly about Bill C-16. It's not totally clear what that would mean, and there's a lot of panic around, particularly how Jordan Peterson was sort of portraying it. But at the very least, I mean, even at its most charitable reading, it is venturing into territory where we are starting to say what can and should be said, which is quite dangerous and something we're thinking about. But I think the point that I was trying to make by bringing in the example of First Nations is that I don't think it's like an insular issue. I think the portrayal of a particular group of citizens as, or not citizens, a particular group of people, but citizens more generally in other countries, as, damaged victims, ultimately responsible for their fate, but not responsible because, psychological damage and so on, is really disarming because it sounds so nice and so caring. But ultimately, we have to be careful about if we have an ideal of democracy, which has at its base the rational subject, we need to be very careful when that's being attacked, because that's what all, whatever you think of it, that's what our institutions are sort of built on. And if you take that away, you can start to see why certain rights and freedoms start to erode, because we no longer believe that human beings are rational and capable of self-governing and deciding for themselves how to live their lives. And that you asked me the most difficult question ever, what do we do about it? And I sort of answered in a very wishy-washy way, that ultimately, self-government is the ideal, and however that works in terms of, territory and so on, is a very, very thorny question. And ultimately, you'd like to have your own territory, like what happened with Nunavut. But ultimately, in a sort of symbolic sense, it's important to stand up for having the last say in decisions that affect you. And that's the lesson for everyone.